We know the Egyptian command structure suffered catastrophic losses early on. Saladin's own nephew, Taqi ad-Din, was in command of the fighting forces, and his son, Ahmad, was killed very early in the engagement. The line simply evaporated under the sustained shock.
And Baldwin was supposedly right there in the thick of it, bandaged hands and all.
He was a presence on the field, absolutely. But the fact that Saladin narrowly escaped capture is the most telling detail about the depth and violence of that Frankish penetration. The English chronicler Ralph de Deseto records that Saladin managed to escape on the back of a swift pack camel, a dromedary, fleeing the field as his entire army collapsed around him.
That paints a picture of pure, total chaos.
And the sheer indignity of the rout, the great sultan fleeing on a baggage animal. The pursuit that followed must have turned what was a tactical reversal into an absolute slaughter.
It was a strategic rout. The pursuit lasted for 12 relentless miles, all the way toward the Egyptian frontier. This prevented any attempt by the scattered Ayyubid units to rally or reform.
The Franks just systematically cut down the dispersed units one by one. Saladin himself didn't stop. He retreated immediately all the way back to Cairo, which is a testament to the absolute scale of the disaster.
The scale of the military catastrophe for Saladin at Montgisard really cannot be overstated.
No, it can't. When he finally reached Cairo on December 8th, it was, by some accounts, with only a 10% of his initial army.
A 90% attrition rate. That isn't just a defeat. That is the effective loss of an entire professional army, including irreplaceable elite forces, horses, and all their material.
It was a profound public humiliation for a leader who was actively cultivating an image as the invincible champion of Islam. Muslim historians later recognized this defeat as a strategic turning point, a disaster so severe that it was only politically redeemed a full 10 years later by the massive victory at Hattin and the subsequent capture of Jerusalem in 1187.
So the immediate shock to morale in the Muslim world must have been immense.
It was huge, even if efforts were made to misinform some of the more distant vassals about the true outcome of the battle.
And for the Crusader kingdom, it was celebrated as a divine vindication, a miracle.
Absolutely. Baldwin IV commissioned the Benedictine monastery to be built right there on the battlefield, and he dedicated it to St. Catherine of Alexandria because the victory fell on her feast day.
But this incredible triumph, it came at a cost that the already tiny, demographically fragile kingdom could barely afford.
The cost was nearly ruinous. Roger de Moulin, who was the Grand Master of the Hospitallers at the time, provided very specific casualty figures. 1,100 men killed and another 750 wounded.
Wait, so that's 1,850 casualties in total? If we take the highest estimate of the Crusader army at 4,500 men, that's a casualty rate approaching 40%.
That is an immense and completely unsustainable demographic drain, especially on the professional fighting classes, the knights, and the local levies that were crucial to holding the frontiers. So while Montgisard was a tactical masterpiece, the steep price meant that even in victory, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was further weakened in its capacity for long-term defense.
But strategically, the victory provided the one thing they desperately needed more than anything else: time.
Crucial time. The defeat prevented Saladin from being able to relieve his Syrian vassals, who were under attack from Raymond of Tripoli's separate northern expedition against Harem. This granted the Franks a strategic respite, allowing them to reorganize, and, perhaps most importantly, giving the young King Baldwin IV unquestionable personal legitimacy as a warrior king.
And here is the core paradox of Montgisard. This is the central tragedy of the kingdom's history, isn't it? The victory cemented Baldwin's legitimacy, but it simultaneously empowered the exact internal political faction that would lead them to collapse a decade later.
That is the tragic historical irony. The hardline policies of Raynald de Chatillon were suddenly spectacularly validated by tactical success. He became an undeniably powerful, influential figure. His aggression was now seen as the winning formula against Saladin.
And he aligned perfectly with the other hawks.
Perfectly with the militaristic faction being led by Baldwin's sister Sibylla and her ambitious husband, Guy of Lusignan. They all came to believe that the path to the kingdom's survival lay in constant confrontation, not caution.
Let's dedicate some serious time to this historiographical conflict around Montgisard, because it highlights how desperately both the Franks and the Arabs needed to create a specific narrative out of this chaos.
It's vital to understanding the legacy. Frankish chroniclers like William of Tyre had a very clear political agenda. They needed to legitimize the rule of this young, sickly, dying king.
So they play up his role.
They heavily minimize Raynald's command role, focusing instead on Baldwin I's piety, his strategic acumen, and the miraculous nature of the victory. The story had to be about the king's miracle, about divinely sanctioned leadership.
Because the king's personal courage elevates the throne, but a rogue baron's brilliance only elevates the baron.
Exactly. It reinforced the royal authority that was necessary to govern the factious nobility. But conversely, you see the Arab chroniclers, Saladin's secretary Imad Adan and others, do the exact opposite. They inflate Raynald's role. They present him as this evil, cunning, strategic mastermind.
And again, just to be clear, the purpose of this inflation was twofold: mitigating the shame of their own defeat and justifying Raynald's subsequent execution.
Precisely. If Saladin was routed, it was better to be routed by the Elephant of Christ, as some sources called Raynald, this notorious figure of immense malevolence and military experience, than by a sickly adolescent. It made the defeat less humiliating.
And the second reason.
Second, Raynald was so universally hated by the Muslim leadership for his uncompromising cruelty, particularly his disregard for truces and its attacks on pilgrims, that elevating him as the sole strategic driver of Montgisard provided clear public justification for Saladin's famous vow to personally kill him years later.
So Raynald, whether we view him as an inconvenient hero or a convenient villain, he became the central figure in the political narrative for both sides after the battle.
He became a narrative anchor. But regardless of who gets the credit for the specific tactics, Montgisard taught Saladin a brutal, unforgettable lesson.
Never again underestimate the Franks.
Never again underestimate the disciplined shock and the capacity for surprise that the Frankish heavy cavalry possessed.
And Saladin, unlike many of the Franks, learned his lesson meticulously.
He changed his entire operational strategy after this. Saladin spent the subsequent decade not on reckless engagements against the main Frankish army, but on methodical consolidation. He systematically secured his base, capturing Aleppo in 1183 and Mosul by 1185.
He secured his flanks.
He made sure his political flank was secure, his logistical lines were robust, and that he could mobilize a larger, more permanent, and better supplied army for the final confrontation. He was never going to be caught unprepared again.
Meanwhile, the very faction in Jerusalem that had been validated by Montgisard, the Raynald faction, was actively setting the kingdom on the road to ruin.
Raynald, now empowered and essentially untouchable because of his success at Montgisard, relentlessly pursued an offensive policy. He consistently violated truces that the pragmatic faction, led by Raymond of Tripoli, had worked so hard to establish.
And his actions were brazen.
Incredibly so. He launched daring raids deep into the Red Sea, threatening the sacred Muslim pilgrimage routes to Mecca, an act that was considered deeply sacrilegious and politically provocative.
So these weren't just territorial disputes anymore. These were attacks that gave Saladin the perfect religious and political pretext to call for a full jihad.
Exactly. They were unpardonable insults. But his most fatal action, the one that triggered the final countdown, was his seizure of a rich caravan in late 1186 or early 1187. He claimed the truce was non-binding upon him.
And this caravan may have included Saladin's sister.
Some reports say it included his sister, and it was certainly filled with immense wealth. This provided Saladin with a public, undeniable excuse he needed to call a full jihad and launch the invasion of 1187.
So the man whose aggression helped save the kingdom in 1177 was the very man whose aggression destroyed it in 1187.
The irony is just breathtaking. Saladin, having learned his lesson from Montgisard, used the subsequent campaign in 1187 to lure the entire Crusader army out onto a dry, waterless plain, the infamous Horns of Hattin.
He reversed the conditions of Montgisard.
He completely reversed them. He waited until the Franks were exhausted, dehydrated, and their horses were weak, effectively neutralizing the powerful shock capacity of their cavalry charge before the battle even began.
And after the crushing defeat there, Saladin personally fulfilled his vow.
He executed Raynald with his own hand in front of the other captured Crusader leaders.
So, to put it all together, Montgisard's tactical success empowered the very hardline faction that lacked the strategic caution necessary for the kingdom's long-term survival.
And it directly enabled the conditions for the total strategic collapse 10 years later. The victory provided the validation that Raynald needed to pursue his reckless policies, and it provided the lesson that Saladin needed to ensure he would never lose that way again.
It's the ultimate lesson in the difference between tactics and strategy.
Tactics win the battle. Strategy wins the war. Baldwin IV demonstrated brilliant tactical genius at Montgisard, but the victory did nothing to heal the profound political and demographic sickness of the kingdom. which was then driven straight into the ground by the hawkishness that Montgisard endorsed.
So, to sum up, the Battle of Montgisard stands as this extraordinary, unforgettable triumph. It was a victory forged in deception. Baldwin IV's brilliant decision to hide and then strike, and executed by the peerless discipline of the heavy cavalry shock doctrine.
And it serves as a powerful testament to how psychological factors, specifically catastrophic overconfidence on Saladin's side and this desperate religious inspiration on the Frankish side, can instantly negate overwhelming numerical advantages.
It secured Baldwin IV's reputation. The Leper King became known as a courageous and highly capable commander who bought his fragile kingdom a necessary, crucial decade of existence.
Yet, as we've analyzed, the victory fundamentally failed to solve any of the underlying problems. The demographic crisis, the succession instability, and those corrosive internal divisions that made long-term survival essentially impossible. That critical respite was ultimately wasted by the very internal machinations it inadvertently validated.
Which brings us to the final provocative question for you to consider as you reflect on this impossible victory. If Montgisard cemented Baldwin's reputation as a hero, and by extension, solidified Raynald's power as a hawkish leader, a power that directly led to the catastrophic defeat at Hatton, how much did the 10 years of delay afforded by this stunning victory ultimately matter?
The paradox of Montgisard is just so stark. It was a brilliant tactical victory that necessitated a massive expenditure of irreplaceable men and empowered the most destructive elements of the kingdom's leadership, only to set the stage for total strategic collapse 10 years later. Was that truly a success at all? It's this moment of pure brilliance that merely postponed the inevitable, and it forces us to ask, could a less aggressive, less costly, or even a diplomatic outcome have saved the kingdom more effectively than this spectacular but ultimately fatal triumph?